And now we're going to listen to Jos Peeters with his presentation on puberty, free will, and idealism in a very improper and basic way. Okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You will have noticed that the last 2 days we have in a quite fast pace. We have went through the phases the child goes through or went through. You came this morning as a baby, and we are now in a phase of puberty. The phase which in the development will lead to maturity. It's a time of challenges, big challenges, of struggle for the puber, but also for the parents and other people involved in the education of the adolescent. You will have noticed in the development of the child, each child has its own characteristics. Where it concerns puberty, most people in first instance are inclined to think about problems and conflicts. Typically one would picture groups of youngsters hanging around who rebel against any form of authority from parents, teachers and the like, and who in general criticize their environment while seeking how far they can push the limits. In fact, we believe that it's all the symptoms of a typical process which is behind this. It's the idealism which is actually reflected here. If more adults were able to see this process, they would take another stance towards today's adolescents and recognize the wonderful promise for the future which lies within the youth. This would then allow them to assist the youngsters in building up a positive vision of life, since this is really what the puberty phase is all about. In order to allow us to understand the source of idealism in the puberty phase, we will focus on the recapitulation process, which we've already addressed several times during this symposium. From the time of our birth, or in fact slightly before, the reincarnating child repeats the various classes which the present fourth round of the School of the Man has already been through many times before. As we previously explained, each time one particular aspect involves, whilst at the same time another aspect evolves. During puberty, the adolescent repeats the fourth round with a particular emphasis on the development of the force of desire. This represents the force which in itself is neutral, that is required to accomplish things, to grow, to build up further insight, and of course to realize them. The desire fuels the essentially free will of the human being, to which Barend referred in his lecture yesterday. The free will directs the desire in a spiritual and selfish, or a materialistic, selfish direction. For example, you decide not to participate in the selfish materialism in the world, and from now on you buy your clothes in second-hand shops. Or you choose to always dress in the latest fashion, regardless of the price, whether it's made, where it's made, and by whom. The fourth phase is a critical phase, the most materialistic phase, the turning point from the materialistic development to the spiritual development.
Stoffelijke ontwikkeling. Theosofie noemt dit de neergaande boog.
So the spiritual development is the upward arch. The persona, being the instrument, has now evolved to such a level that the higher nature may now start exercising its influence. The fourth phase represents a period of inner struggle with the temptations of the lower nature and a time during which the independent ethical choices can be made. Are we consciously making the choice to satisfy materialistic desires, one's own interests, or do we realize the limitations thereof and use our spiritually focused free will and decide to strive after higher, more noble goals? This choice we make determines whether we will follow the ascending arch or whether we remain at the same level. Are you now in a position to actually see what's going on in your struggling adolescent? His or her higher self presents itself in this stage and exercises its influence. This higher nature obviously represents the relative eternal part of the human being, the reincarnating part. The actor in the drama of life, his or her higher, more noble, universal thoughts developed in his previous lives, and ideals which are universal, which are connected with the spiritual and divine part. Great ideas, for example, about peace, justice, beauty, and universal brotherhood. These great thoughts slowly and gradually arise within the adolescent as a memory, together with a strong desire to manifest these ideals. Can you now picture the confusion and struggle within the adolescent? The innocence of childhood has come to an end. The world is suddenly viewed with different eyes, which brings about a shock, since this new picture of the world is far from his or her ideal picture. Hypocrisy, violence, hate, selfishness, injustice, etc. Thereby, the adolescent lacks the experience to always deal with these matters in a wise manner. In this respect, think of young Muslim boys and girls who impulsively decide to leave for Syria in the belief to be able to realize their Islamic ideals. They do not see what is, I think, not really what's going on in this country, and they do not have the patience to first thoroughly consider their actions and seek advice from wiser people. We assume that the source of their conflicts doesn't puzzle you anymore, and why adolescents rebel against any type of authority, and often, firstly, their parents. It actually would be worrying if this did not happen. During this phase, idealism should find its way. Children who do not find any inspiration at home will seek so outside their home environment. This often takes the form of worshipping certain heroes. Boys and girls often identify with idols from the music, sports or political arena. They may also be entirely absorbed by work for Greenpeace or Amnesty International. As an example, reference can be made to the young Pakistani girl Malala, who already at a very young age and with danger for her own life, made the decision to fight for the freedom of education of girls, for girls. By the way, this afternoon in the bookstore upstairs, there are a couple of books from Malala about children, often in this stage of their life, who by taking action are in a position to change the world. And a very nice example, which will be nice for our German guest, Christiane F. Kinderen am Zoo, a young puber girl who was into the drug scene in Berlin and was able to escape from that, and at a later stage she was a girl or a woman who was able to use that experience to try to avoid that other pubers and youngsters would not take that route. So I can really recommend that to you. Quite some parents experience a shock in the process of finding out that their child has changed into an adolescent who's difficult to handle. Although the severe problems which arise in this stage are obviously known, since every parent was once an adolescent, most parents have hardly studied the specific characteristics of this phase, and in particular its causes.
In de specifieke kenmerken van deze fase en in het bijzonder de oorzaken ervan.
We believe that parents undervalue their ability to parent, but also that they fall short of their duty to be a good parent and coach for their child. The child does not know at all how or he should deal with the situation. This attracts the danger that wrong choices will be made and the adverse consequences of which may be felt for the rest of the child's life. Getting a tattoo may then be seen as a relatively harmless example. It seems that a letter is missing, so maybe they paid on the basis of the number of letters. Anyhow, the adolescents are not to blame. They have no understanding of their own nature and have not learned how to control themselves at a younger age. Thereby, any opportunity of the parent to take action to prevent a wrong decision will be too late, since typically the parents are about the last persons with whom the child or the adolescent wishes to discuss the challenges of life. It is for that reason that during this symposium you've heard us say on various occasions that one cannot start early enough in following a Rãja-Yoga education. The child will then have developed knowledge about life in an early stage and will be acquainted with compassion and brotherhood. He or she will know the duality of his or her own nature, and by using his spiritually focused will, he will be able to control his lower aspects. And most importantly, he will have learned to rely on his higher nature, which represents the self with a capital S. With the Rãja-Yoga education, the child has developed his thinking faculty with the trust that he is in essence a divine being who already possesses all knowledge with him. Plato already said that learning is remembering. And isn't it more interesting when studying, for example, the history of certain civilizations, the functioning of universal principles such as reincarnation, karma, and cyclicality, which can be recognized, instead of purely memorizing facts? Through Rãja-Yoga education, the child received an optional preparation for the puberty phase. The child has self-confidence and instinctively recognizes the difference between good and bad. It can resist certain temptations without always being in a position to explain why. It feels connected with all other life, which gives a sense of responsibility to the child. A sense of responsibility. Finally, the child knows that his parents will support him. As Bauke pointed out yesterday, from its birth they've protected the child against negative influences by creating a mental atmosphere, a good mental atmosphere, and by living a good example. They've created a foundation and offered the building blocks for its character, which can then be expressed independently.
The parent's role changes during puberty. The child wants to explore the world independently and to create his own worldview. It requires the parents to take a more distant stance. The child should be given more liberty, allowing it to explore the world. Secondary schools typically facilitate this by organizing study trips during which the pupils will be away from home for a week. This stimulates boys and girls to carry out activities independently and to work together. Does this mean that the protective role of the parent has come to an end? By all means, no, it hasn't. They'll always be around to help their daughter or their son. In this phase, it will be more on equal footing with the child. This new colleague has now advanced in its education to such a level that it doesn't want to have someone around who is constantly observing him. He needs someone who now and then watches along with him and whom he can discuss how things are progressing and what may be improved. A good occasion for this, and we already talked about this, is a joint meal during which the day can be discussed, experiences are exchanged, problems are shared, and their possible solutions are addressed. Thereby, you may point to the books of the great teachers of the world, such as Plato, Gautama the Buddha, Lao Tzu, or Gandhi, Mandela, or Martin Luther King. It is recommendable to take the habit of having a conversation as equals with your son or daughter, since this not only allows you to better help them, but you will also find that you will have a friend for the rest of your life. Furthermore, it is important to create a safe home base, a home with a harmonious atmosphere where the parents set the example. It is typically the case that the children of parents who live in accordance with the Theosophical principles will later do so themselves. A Rãja-Yoga education will see to it that your son or daughter is better equipped for the struggle of duality which he will face during puberty. This is not to say that it will always be an easy task. There may be karmic circumstances, as we already talked about this yesterday in the workshop, the karmic circumstances from other lives, previous lives, that may provide necessary challenges. And a royal education is obviously not a guarantee for the kingship and the leadership qualities belonging thereto. Not all material is the same, is what Herman already referred to. But a Rãja-Yoga education will in any case ascertain that the inner divine glory, which forms the essence of each human being, will have the best chance of manifesting itself and of influencing his life. We have assumed that the child had an education in line with the principles of the Rãja-Yoga education as of its birth. We did so to show you an ideal picture. We clearly realize that today there are also parents of teenagers amongst you who learn about our ideas for the first time. You may think that you have not done enough for your teenager, and you may ask, what can you still do to offer him or her some of the wisdom of the Rãja-Yoga education? To these parents, we want to say that from the reincarnating point of view, it is never too late to put the newly obtained knowledge into practice. You can already start doing so tomorrow or this evening by taking some time to discuss with your teenager the ideas which we have presented to you these last 2 days. Talk about this with your teenager. What is his or her opinion? And if you think that you're still looking for truth, then we are convinced that you will notice that he or she will be more open to the discussion than you may suspect. In the heart of each human being, a desire burns for a greater truth, and this desire is strongest with adolescence. Look through the expression of the personality and behind the mask of the persona, the apparent boredom, indifference, and distant attitude. Focus from your higher nature on the reincarnating part of your teenager, his treasure room of higher thoughts, insights, and ideals, in fact, what he truly is. And if you go on the basis of equality and with trust in your higher nature and that of your teenager, you will reach him. In this respect, I may refer to the principle of the sender and receiver which Bouke addressed in his lecture yesterday, a principle which always works, also in connecting with adolescents. Lastly, let us not forget that raising a child is also a learning process for the parent. The teenager, ladies and gentlemen, will become a young adult. In his recapitulation process, he will start the 5th class of the present 4th round. The intellect is in the process of controlling the desire.
Dat is het intellect dat in deze klas zich ontwikkelt, wat de begeerte geleidelijk meer
The
en meer
nearly adult learns to stick to his ideas without being distracted that easily. He still does not yet know what life will bring, but he will be determined and full of confidence that he will fulfill his duties to himself, the family of which he is part of, his country, and the world as a whole. His Rãja-Yoga education has seen to it that there is a perfect balance between all of his faculties, physical, mental, and spiritual. You could call this a strong character. As a parent, you will say goodbye to your child. Your new colleague is prepared. You will pursue your path in life together as colleagues and friends. Your task as parent is ended. Your child is now an adult, and he has arrived at the level of development where he remained in his previous life. He will take responsibility for his own life and will shape it independently. How this will evolve will be further explained to you by Herman in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.
Dank u wel voor uw aandacht. Goed, dames en heren.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Heeft u vragen
are there
over
any
deze
questions
bijdrage?
about this
Graag.
lecture?
Wat eventjes kort, hoe omschreef je nou karakterkracht?
How can you describe that strong character?
Heb ik dat op een sheet staan, geloof ik, was het niet?
Wasn't it on the sheet?
Ja, hier staan in feite een perfecte balans.
It's actually just the perfect balance between all of these faculties, physical, mental, and spiritual.
Die in deze termen op deze sheet denk ik u terugvindt.
I think you can find the explanation in the sheet on the there. It's full of self-control and self-respect, confident and determined. If you put all of these things together, we could say that's a really strong character. And that confidence is a very important aspect in this phase that is developed. Confidence in your own higher nature, to know what's sustainable and not sustainable, and no matter what the future brings, you're ready for it. A completely balanced character in all the aspects. Is that a good answer? All right.
Dank u wel. Er zijn ook jongvolwassenen die hun ouders nog heel lang nodig hebben.
There are also young adults who need their parents for a long time. For even into their adulthood, they still need their parents. Is there something wrong with these kids, or you said that your task as being a parent is finished when they're around 23 years? But oh, I'd misunderstood then. He said I didn't even name an age. No, she says around 23 years, and he says, well, you're right, but I didn't say an age. I think you'll have noticed in these last 2 days that they were actually very careful in withholding about naming any ages. Because for everyone, that's a very individual difference. There is no definite. And of course, there's kids that are in the puberty phase that they stay in that for a lot longer. And they're opposite of that, there's other kids who are much earlier finished with the puberty phase. It differs. Oh, I misunderstood then. She was thinking 23 years of age, but you thought, well, that's a pretty good average age, you could say. Thank you. It's very karmically very interesting that you asked this question to Jos. Because I know that their kids... Oh, I don't know what he said.
Maybe to add to that, my children really left home, but they come home frequently. They have an independent life, that's true. But we had at a certain age, and we really looked at each other and thought, you know, this is the time for the children to go and live elsewhere. So it was quite a conscious decision and a conscious goodbye to a certain phase. And we have very good memories of that, but and the children as well. Myself, often in my life, I have guided children from conscious to unconscious life. And I looked into myself to look at the conscious and my unconscious life, and I have to waken up and look at, okay, this is what I did to myself, trying to become more conscious of what's going on, and going from unconscious to a more conscious life, and that's what I actually also thought for myself. So, and it's always good to self-reflect on this and think about what you could have done and what you have done and whether you did it right or not, because each moment in that period, not only in the period up to 21st year, as Herman will point out in his next stage, it's not so that only around 21, 23 years old the story ends. If you haven't made it then for the rest of your life you can better sit somewhere behind the flowers and stop doing anything. So keep learning, but I don't want to be premature on talking about Herman's presentation, but in any case, up to the last moment, there's possibilities to learn. Oh, that's okay, that's okay. You also took 2 parts of my presentation already, so. I come from a different culture. What I've noticed, there was always this picture that Western people at a very young age would send their children away from home. And thinking about this lecture, I see the difference. We are, in our culture, treated much longer children and always remain children and always be treated as children, and then the whole relationship is not based on equality, and as a result you always stay a child. The whole vision here is that from a very young age always treats the child as equal. This is very nice, and it should also in reality happen that you become equal. So you need the right preparation to become equals. So I can now see how it happens in my culture. It's good that you mentioned it, and it's also nice that you mentioned it, because you look from outside to what's happening here and what's being told here. And of course this is an ideal picture, and we know in the Netherlands as well, in our culture, parents and children who really stick to each other. But I also have a relationship with Asia, and there you see, for example, in the more fortunate families, rich families, you see that children and parents never actually separate, and I think that's actually pretty worrying as well. I'm wondering, how did it go for children who didn't have any parents, but still were successful in society? How did that happen? Do you have any idea about that? I have a book with all sort of examples of histories of children who at very young age, under very difficult circumstances, were in a position to become successful in society. So we here talk about an ideal situation of the Rãja-Yoga education, but we are very conscious that today in this world the ideal situation often doesn't exist. And often children who are born in very difficult circumstances, they are in a position, and really they have probably now from their previous life they have appeared to deal and cope with these difficult circumstances and get out of these circumstances, and actually they are examples for us. Examples of situations where if you have problems you can always solve these problems, how difficult and how hard the situation may be. But for these children, these are learning moments for them to come out of that situation. The first 9 months of a child, therefore, are the most important. Yesterday we had the lecture that the first 3 years are the most important, but of course everything is at one stage important. But the beginning, yes, the beginning is for a child to have an optimal preparation for its life, so to say. If you want to make the comparison with a flower, you would have to give water in the very beginning. The very beginning, that's very important. But also we know that under very tough circumstances, beautiful flower flourish. Good. Here's still someone with a question. Maybe in addition, the role of the other than the parents is maybe important to point out. School, other benefactors, preachers, whatever now. Thank you for your comment. In addition, we talk about parents the couple of last days or the last 2 days, but all of its environment, and a child is born in a certain family, in a certain village, an area, city, town, country, and everything has to do with everything. So that's the idea of unity and influences each other, and therefore everyone has a role within that unity within the child's environment, distant or nearby, when it starts its career in life. Colleagues. Okay? Thank you, Jos.